She thought it was just a small act of kindness, paying for an old man's groceries when his card declined at the checkout. But just hours later, her quiet evening at home turned into something out of a movie. The rumble of engines shattered. The silence as 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of her house, their tinted windows hiding the figures inside. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, confused and afraid. Why would an innocent gesture attract this kind of attention? And what exactly was she about to discover when those doors finally opened? On the surface, Emily's life seemed simple, almost ordinary. She was a young professional in her late 20s, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets were lined with trimmed hedges, well-kept lawns, and mailboxes all painted the same shade of green. To anyone passing through, it was the kind of community that appeared picture-perfect, a place where nothing ever went wrong, where neighbors waved politely, and homeowners associations prided themselves on keeping everything under control. Emily had moved into her modest home just 2 years earlier, proud to finally own something she could call her own. Her days were filled with long work hours at the local hospital, where she served as a nurse, and her nights often ended with quiet. Walks through the cul-de-sac or evenings reading on her front porch. She didn't see herself as someone who attracted attention. She lived with intention, careful not to step on anyone's toes in a community where gossip traveled faster than the wind. But despite her quiet nature, Emily had something most people overlooked: a habit of helping without asking for anything in return. She believed that small acts of kindness mattered, even if no one noticed them. Whether it was checking in on her elderly neighbor, returning a runaway dog, or picking up trash during her walks, Emily had built a quiet reputation for being the good one in the neighborhood. Some admired her generosity, while others whispered that she was too involved, the kind of person who didn't quite fit into the unspoken rule of minding your own business. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon after finishing a long shift that Emily decided to stop by the ICA grocery store just a few blocks from her house. Tired, she kept her head down, scanning through her list, filling her cart with the usual: fruit, vegetables, a carton of milk, and a loaf of bread. It wasn't until she reached the checkout line that something unusual caught her attention. Just ahead of her was an older man, his clothes worn, his posture slightly bent from age. He looked nervous as he placed a few simple items on the conveyor belt: bread, soup, and some canned beans. When the cashier read him the total, his hands trembled as he swiped his card, only for the machine to decline it again and again. His face flushed with embarrassment, his voice lowered to a near whisper as he asked the cashier to try one more time. The line behind him grew restless, and some customers sighed impatiently. Emily didn't hesitate. Without second-guessing herself, she stepped forward, pulled out her card, and quietly said she would cover it. The old man turned to her, eyes wide with surprise, and for a brief moment, gratitude softened the deep lines on his face. He muttered a soft thank you, his voice shaky, as if unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of kindness. To Emily, it was nothing extraordinary. It was just another chance to help, something she would have done for anyone. She smiled, took her bags, and left the store without thinking twice. What she didn't realize was that this seemingly small gesture had set into motion a chain of events she could never have predicted. By the time Emily returned home that evening, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across her yard. She placed her groceries in the kitchen, fed her cat, and settled into her usual routine. Everything felt normal, ordinary, safe. But in neighborhoods like hers, where appearances were everything, the smallest deviation from routine could stir curiosity. And kindness, as simple as it seemed, had a way of drawing attention she never asked for. As night settled, Emily had no idea that before long, the sound of engines would break the stillness of her quiet street. And the sight of 3 black SUVs rolling up to her house would turn her life upside down. At first, Emily thought nothing of it. 3 black SUVs showing up on her street was strange, yes, but in a neighborhood filled with watchful eyes and HOA board members who prided themselves on control. Strange wasn't always unusual. Cars parked where they shouldn't be. Neighbors arguing over fence lines. Delivery trucks arriving late at night. All of it had, at one time or another, triggered whispers of suspicion. But this was different. These SUVs didn't belong to anyone she recognized. They weren't flashy, but they were intimidating. Tinted windows, spotless black paint, and men in dark clothing stepping out as though they were on official business. Emily had watched from behind her curtains, her heart pounding as they approached her driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, eerily so, yet she knew people were watching. Blinds tilted just enough, eyes peering through gaps, waiting for drama. The men didn't knock. They stood outside, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing up at her house. Emily's mind raced. Was it a mistake? Were they law enforcement? Did it have something to do with the man at the grocery store? She wanted answers, but instinct told her to stay still. Eventually, after nearly 20 minutes, the SUVs pulled away, leaving behind silence and 100 questions. Emily didn't know it yet, but that moment had marked her. The next morning, she woke to find a bright yellow envelope taped to her front door. It wasn't from the men in black, it was from her HOA. The message was blunt, aggressive, and oddly specific. Unauthorized visitors parked in front of your property. This violates community regulations. Fine, $250. Emily stared at the A's paper, stunned. The SUVs hadn't even parked on her property. They'd been on the public street. She had no connection to them. And yet, here was her HOA, already holding her accountable. She crumpled the notice in frustration, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the harassment escalated. Another letter arrived, this one citing her for improper lawn care. Emily blinked at the accusation. Her grass was trimmed, her hedges neat, and her yard tidy. The wording was vague, almost mocking. Failure to maintain property aesthetics. The fines stacked quickly. $250, $300, another $100. Each envelope carried a sharper tone, implying that she was becoming a nuisance to the neighborhood. Neighbors who once waved politely now avoided eye contact. Whispers rose as she walked past. The perfect, quiet world Emily had worked so hard to be a part of was slowly turning against her. What unsettled her most was the timing. Before the grocery store incident, before the SUVs, she had lived 2 years without a single HOA complaint. And now, within days of that one small act of kindness, her life was unraveling. She tried to reason with the HOA. She showed up at the EE board's monthly meeting, her papers in hand, ready to defend herself. The room was filled with the usual suspects, board members sitting stiffly behind a table, smug in their authority, and homeowners slouched in folding chairs, whispering. As each case was read aloud, when Emily's name was called, she stepped forward. Calmly, she explained that the SUVs were not hers, that her lawn was in perfect condition, that the sudden flood of fines felt targeted. The board listened, but their expressions were stone. One woman, the HOA president, leaned forward with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Rules are rules," she said, tapping her pen against the desk. "And we've received concerns about your recent activities. Unusual visitors, disruptions to the community. We can't allow behaviors that make residents feel unsafe." Emily's stomach dropped. Unsafe? What had she done except help an old man pay for groceries? She left the meeting humiliated, her words dismissed as though they carried no weight. And as she walked out, she noticed several neighbors glaring at her, their whispers sharp and unkind. It wasn't just the board, anymore. It was the entire community turning against her. The fines kept coming, but now the HOA's pressure became personal. One morning she found her trash bins overturned, garbage scattered across her yard. Another day she woke to see someone had spray-painted a crude message on the side of her mailbox. "Get out!" She filed complaints, but the HOA brushed them off suggesting maybe she had invited this trouble. The implication was clear. She was being painted as the problem. Emily's frustration grew into fear. Each night, she double-checked her locks. She watched from her window as unfamiliar cars drove slowly past her house, headlights lingering on her driveway. And then, late one evening, she saw them again, the same 3 black SUVs parked at the end of the street. Her heart raced. Were they connected to the HOA? Were they watching her? Or was this something bigger, something she couldn't yet comprehend? She considered moving, but the HOA's grip made that nearly impossible. With the fines piling up, a lien threatened her property. They were pushing her into a corner, forcing her to either submit or lose everything she had worked for. And still, she couldn't understand why. The old man at the grocery store flashed through her mind again and again. His trembling hands, his gratitude, his quiet, "Thank you." Who was he? Why had that moment, that act of kindness, spiraled into this nightmare? And then came the letter that changed everything. It wasn't an HOA notice this time. It wasn't a fine or a warning. It was a plain white envelope, slipped under her door in the dead of night. Inside was a single piece of paper with just 6 words written in bold black ink. "They know what you did." The room spun as Emily read the note over and over. Her pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was personal, calculated, deliberate. Someone was watching her. Someone knew more than she could possibly understand. And just as the fear began to overwhelm her, headlights swept across her living room walls. She froze, peering through the blinds. At the end of her driveway sat the same black SUVs, engines idling, their presence suffocating. Emily backed away, her hands trembling. The HOA had made her life miserable, yes. But this was bigger. The line between neighborhood politics and something far darker had been crossed. The question that haunted her now wasn't just whether she could fight back against her HOA. It was something far more terrifying. Who exactly had she helped that day in the grocery store? And why were powerful people suddenly at her door? The tension had been building for days, but nothing compared to what was about to unfold. Emily thought she had already seen the worst of the HOA's pettiness. The bogus fines, the threatening letters, the invasive patrols. But the evening the black SUVs rolled up again, this time with purpose, the entire neighborhood seemed to freeze. Engines roared low as the vehicles lined up in front of her house, their headlights slicing through the dusk. Doors opened in perfect unison, and out stepped men and women in dark suits, earpieces tucked neatly in place. They didn't look like neighbors, they didn't look like realtors, and they certainly didn't look like HOA volunteers. They looked like authority. The kind of authority that could silence a neighborhood in seconds. The HOA president, Mrs. Langford, stood smugly across the street, arms folded, surrounded by her bored loyalists. To her, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The spectacle of Emily finally being put in her place. The whispers spread like wildfire. Some neighbors peeked through blinds, while others dared to stand on their porches, straining to catch every detail. Emily's heart raced. She had no idea what they wanted from her, or why these SUVs seemed to be connected to her small act of kindness at the grocery store. She braced herself for the worst, but instead of heading toward her door in a show of force, the suited figures walked right past her fence line and directly toward Mrs. Langford. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Langford's confident smile faltered as one of the agents produced a folder, thick with papers. The lead agent's voice cut through the silence. "Homeowners Association President Linda Langford, we need to speak with you immediately regarding serious allegations of harassment, unlawful conduct, and targeted discrimination." The color drained from her face. Emily stood frozen, barely believing what she was witnessing. The woman who had spent weeks tormenting her now looked cornered, scrambling for excuses. She sputtered something about protecting community standards, but the agent silenced her with a single raised hand. What no one in the neighborhood knew, what Emily herself hadn't fully grasped, was that the old man she had helped at the grocery store wasn't just any retiree struggling with a card that wouldn't swipe. He was a federal judge, recently retired but still highly respected in government circles, and when Emily had stepped in with kindness, asking for nothing in return, he had remembered her name, her face, and her generosity. So when reports reached his desk about a young woman in his city being systematically targeted by a power-drunk HOA, he put two and two together. That's why the SUVs had arrived. That's why agents were now circling Mrs. Langford like sharks smelling blood in the water. Emily's hands trembled as realization sank in. Her smallest act of kindness had triggered something extraordinary, and now justice was unfolding in front of the very neighbors who had once questioned her place in the community. The HOA president's protests grew louder, shriller. She demanded to know what authority these people had, insisting she had every right to enforce rules, to protect neighborhood standards. But as the agents began reading off a list of her misdeeds, falsified fines, misuse of HOA funds, targeting homeowners of color with stricter enforcement, her voice cracked. Every word struck like a hammer against her carefully built image of control. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Suddenly all the whispers about missing funds, suspicious fines, and selective enforcement didn't sound like gossip anymore. They sounded like truth. And through it all, Emily remained silent, standing tall on her porch, every eye in the neighborhood slowly shifting from the crumbling HOA president to the young woman she had tried to break. But the climax wasn't over yet. The agents weren't just there to shame Mrs. Langford. They had evidence. Thick binders were handed over, photographs, bank statements, written testimonies from homeowners who had been silenced by fear or threats. The HOA board members who had stood proudly by her side moments earlier now began to inch away, each one realizing the shield of power they had clung to was dissolving in real time. The old man from the grocery store wasn't there in person, but his presence was undeniable. It was his name, his seal, his quiet influence that had set all of this into motion. He had sent a clear message. Kindness has power, and abuse of authority has consequences. Mrs. Langford, red-faced and trembling, finally tried to storm away, but two agents stepped in her path. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice shaking. But for the first time, no one believed her. No one cheered her. No one even followed her. She was alone. Emily felt the shift like a wave washing over the entire street. The neighbors who had whispered about her, who had sided with the HOA out of fear, now looked at her with new eyes. Some with guilt, some with admiration, and some with the dawning realization that the entire balance of power in their neighborhood had just changed. But before Emily could even process the relief, the lead agent turned to her, his expression firm but respectful. "Emily, we'll need your cooperation in the next phase of this investigation." The words hit like a thunderclap. The story wasn't finished. This wasn't just about fines or petty HOA disputes anymore. It was about something much larger, something that had been festering beneath the surface of the neighborhood for years. As the SUV's engines roared back to life and Mrs. Langford was quietly escorted inside one of them, Emily stood frozen on her porch, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had survived the storm, but the storm wasn't over. It was only changing shape. And as the last black SUV pulled away, leaving the stunned silence of her neighbors in its wake, Emily whispered to herself the question that everyone watching was now asking. If this is what happens after one act of kindness, what's about to happen next? The night the SUVs disappeared from her street, Emily barely slept. She kept replaying everything in her mind, the accusations, the gasps from neighbors, the sight of Mrs. Langford being escorted away like a disgraced politician. It all felt surreal, almost like she had stepped into someone else's story. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. The same people who once averted their eyes when Emily walked her dog now slowed down near her driveway, curiosity spilling from their every glance. Some waved awkwardly. A few crossed the street just to say they never agreed with the HOA anyway. But Emily knew the truth. Most had stayed silent until it was safe to speak. Still, the shift was undeniable. Power had changed hands overnight. Within days, news spread beyond their gated streets. Local reporters showed up, cameras flashing, eager to cover the downfall of the once feared HOA president. They uncovered years of questionable fines, harassment campaigns, and financial irregularities, buried in board records. Homeowners who had been too afraid to speak now lined up to tell their stories, voices cracking with relief as they shared how they'd been bullied into submission by rules that never made sense. Emily's act of kindness at a grocery store had ignited something far bigger than herself. She hadn't just saved an old man a little dignity. She had exposed the rot festering inside a system meant to protect homeowners. The investigation deepened. Federal authorities traced HOA funds that had mysteriously vanished, money that should have gone to community upkeep but instead financed luxury vacations, shopping sprees, and, shockingly, security patrols designed to intimidate anyone who resisted. What neighbors thought were small abuses of power turned out to be an entire structure of corruption. Mrs. Langford was indicted, not only for financial crimes, but also for civil rights violations tied directly to her discriminatory enforcement. Her smugness, once unshakable, crumbled in the glare of courtroom lights. And while she hired lawyers and spun excuses, the evidence stacked higher and higher until her protests rang hollow. 2. The neighborhood, once divided by fear, now faced a choice. Without its president, the HOA had to reorganize. For the first time in years, meetings were filled with honest debate instead of intimidation. People who had never dared to raise their hands before now spoke freely. Transparency replaced secrecy. Emily was asked to join the interim board, a request that both humbled and terrified her. She hadn't asked for this fight. She'd only wanted to live in peace. But she realized something important. Silence had allowed the abuse to grow. Her neighbors needed someone unafraid to stand up, someone who had faced the worst of the HOA and hadn't backed down. She accepted. It wasn't easy. Cleaning up years of corruption took time. Rebuilding trust took longer. But step by step, the community shifted. Rules were rewritten, fines reviewed, and the homeowners who had once lived under constant threat finally began to breathe again. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like what it was supposed to be, a home, not a battlefield. And then came the letter. Weeks after the trial began, Emily received a handwritten note in her mailbox. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the old man, Judge Whitaker. In careful script, he wrote, "Emily, people often forget that small acts of kindness ripple further than we ever imagine. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I carried on my shoulders. But you gave freely, with no expectation of return. That single choice revealed truth in a place where lies had ruled. Never underestimate the power of standing up, even in the smallest ways. The world has enough fear. Be the reason someone remembers there is still good." Tears blurred her vision as she read it. He didn't sign it with a title, just his name. And somehow that made it mean even more. From that day forward, Emily carried those words like armor. When neighbors thanked her, she deflected the praise, reminding them that change only lasts when everyone stands together. She refused to let the community slide back into apathy. Months later, Mrs. Langford's sentencing made headlines. The sight of her, once so powerful, now reduced to a cautionary tale, sent shockwaves through HOA boards across the region. Suddenly, other homeowners began to question their own associations. Complaints surfaced in nearby neighborhoods. Investigations opened. A chain reaction spread far beyond Emily's street. The story of one woman who refused to break, and one old man who refused to stay silent, became a symbol. It wasn't just about a grocery store or an SUV. It was about the dangerous weight of unchecked authority and the courage it takes to stop it. In the end, Emily's neighborhood wasn't perfect. Disagreements still happened. People still grumbled about lawns and fences, but something fundamental had shifted. Fear no longer ruled. And Emily, she went back to living her life, walking her dog, watering her garden, waving at neighbors, who now waved back not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Yet every time she passed the spot in the grocery store where she had once helped Judge Whitaker, she felt a quiet reminder of how fragile and powerful moments can be. Because, in the end, it wasn't the SUVs, the indictments, or even the courtroom battles that changed everything. It was a single, simple decision made in seconds to care when she didn't have to. That was the turning point. That was the spark. And now, as her community stood stronger, freer, and more united than ever before, Emily couldn't help but wonder if one act of kindness could expose years of corruption. What else could we change if we stopped being afraid?